recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Stanley Krippner, the pioneering consciousness researcher, psychologist, and parapsychologist whose work on dreams, altered states of consciousness, and shamanic practices has helped shape contemporary understandings of human consciousness. He directed the famed Maimonides Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn, where he conducted landmark dream telepathy experiments, and later collaborated with the Grateful Dead on visionary ESP studies that explored the relationship between group intention, music, and dreaming. Over the decades, he has also been closely associated with the psychedelic research movement, including early work alongside figures like Timothy Leary at his now infamous psilocybin experiments at Harvard. Educated at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Northwestern University, Dr. Krippner has authored and edited numerous books and scientific articles and has received major international awards for his contributions in humanistic, transpersonal, and consciousness studies. At the tender young age of 93, Dr. Krippner is still extremely active, speaking at international conferences and writing prolifically. Stick around to the end of the video. I'll share information, including where to get tickets for the upcoming Brain and Consciousness Conference in Cuenca, Ecuador, May 13th through 15th. Speakers will include Dr. Stanley Krippner, Stuart Hameroff, Dr. Gomez Marin, and several others. I will be in attendance, as well as numerous people from our community. So I hope to see you there. Let's get into the interview. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today, Dr. Krippner. It really is an honor to be able to speak with you. Your work has had a tremendous influence on consciousness research in general and my life personally. I first encountered your work in the book Dream Telepathy, which was, of course, an account of the work that you did during your time as the research director at the Maimonides Dream Research Laboratory, which produced some pretty extraordinary results. In recent years, much of the findings that were presented in your early research have been corroborated by more recent findings, including the connection between geomagnetic activity and solar activity and ESP-type phenomena and mystical experiences.
Well, first of all, I have to congratulate you for telling your viewers all these interesting and important topics that usually are not discussed. So, now you've asked me a question that goes back many, many decades, and to tell your viewers a little bit of a background, for 10 years, my colleagues and I conducted research on dream telepathy, having people in a laboratory try to dream about what was going on in a different part of the area. Usually somebody who's looking at a short movie or a series of slides. And over the course of the 10 years, we produced data that were statistically significant, far beyond what you'd expect by chance. Now, I decided to take a closer look and see if this is related with geomagnetic activity. In other words, the activity that results from activity solar issues with the sun, electrical storms, etc. And what inspired me was research done at the turn of the century in the early 1900s when people in England were asked about their anomalous experiences, and years later, Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist from Canada, found out that their anomalous experiences more often than not happened when the solar activity was quiet, when geomagnetic fields were low. So this is what inspired me, and I published 2 different reports on this. Yes, the dream telepathy was more acute, more correct, when the geomagnetic activity was quiet and calm.
Those experiments in dream telepathy definitely set a lot of precedents and produced a lot of other interesting data in regards to the psychological disposition and emotional disposition. If people are more open, for example, they had a higher hit rate, and it did produce a 63% hit rate, which is with odds against chance of about 75 million to 1. So that's Pretty incredible. I also wanted to ask you about your work with Dr. Timothy Leary. You were one of the first psychologist volunteers for his now infamous psilocybin experiments at Harvard. Can you tell me how that came to be and a little bit about what that experience was like?
Well, early on, I heard about psychedelics and did a lot of reading on the topic. And I realized that they would be very, very important in the study of consciousness. And so I was a volunteer in Timothy Leary's psilocybin experiments at Harvard University. In fact, I was one of the very last people who participated in the project legally. And so I write all about this in my memoirs, A Chaotic Life, if any of your viewers want to read about all the details. But Tim was very, very gracious, very hospitable, and he had two of his assistants work with me and a friend of mine, Stephen Kleinberg, who was a graduate student at Harvard, taking psilocybin. And of course, we had very intense and beautiful and wonderful experiences that I wrote up and published almost immediately. And so that was my introduction. And I realized that this would be important not only for creativity, but for psychotherapy. And I wrote my first article on the topic in 1968 and wrote literally dozens of articles since that time up to the present. So Tim and I remained good friends, even though I really felt he went off the track. He became a guru instead of a scientist, and now he is, in many quarters, regarded as sort of a folk hero. So he has made his historical mark, and even though I was not too happy about the direction he took, we remained good friends until he died.
You were also good friends with Joseph Campbell, the eminent Harvard mythologist, who is one of the greatest minds of all time, in my opinion, and a huge influence on me. But he also was a fan of the Grateful Dead, who you also worked with. Campbell went so far as to call the Grateful Dead the antidote to the atom bomb. And he also said that in all of his decades of scouring the earth looking for proof that magic was a real phenomenon, the only times he witnessed like objectively real natural magic was in the jungles of Borneo and at Grateful Dead concerts. So I just had to ask, did you have anything to do with introducing Joseph Campbell to the Grateful Dead?
Introduced himself to the Grateful Dead without my help. And Joe, of course, is very, very wise. And I think that he realized that the Grateful Dead were producing music that was quite unique. I had the same experience when I first heard the Grateful Dead and realized that even though I liked rock music, I thought that this music had something special. It was a synthesis of so many musical genres. And then, by chance, I got to meet the Grateful Dead and was able to go backstage and visit with them during their concerts. And then there was one day when Jerry Garcia said, "We're going to be doing a series of gigs in Port Chester, New York." Now, this is 50 years ago. Why don't we do a dream telepathy experiment with the members of the audience trying to send images from the concert to your sleeping subject in the dream lab? So I designed a 6-night study, and about 1 hour into the concert, a assistant flipped a coin, and this determined the image to be shown on the screen. So the members of the audience, most of whom were high on marijuana and psychedelics, saw this big sign, "You are about to participate in a dream telepathy experiment." Malcolm Bessett is asleep in the Dream Laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. Here is a slide. Try to send this image to him. And then the picture would be shown on the screen, a very, very colorful art print. And then the Grateful Dead would make comments about it and resume their concert.
We have a very beautiful picture of the 7 spinal chakras in this yogi meditating.
When I saw that, I said, no way. No one's going to guess this. And sure enough, there was like more hits than not, right?
More hits than not, yeah. He did incredibly well on it. Malcolm Besant had all these dreams about a man who had undergone spiritual training. He had an energy box in his body, and one thing after another tied in with the picture.
Energy box is good.
Yeah.
That was an amazing thing, you know, the idea of group power and thought, being able to translate that thought process into real information and actually send it.
Right.
Got it.
Well, this was 6 nights. And when the statistics came in, the sleeping subject, Malcolm Besant, who's an English psychic, by the way, nailed the image 6 out of 8 times. You'd expect 1 out of 8 times. He did 6 out of 8 times. Again, statistically significant. So that is how I brought my experimental mindset into my work with the Grateful Dead. By the way, that study has been published numerous times, and I'm about to republish it again, sort of as a 50-year anniversary.
That is absolutely incredible, Dr. Krippner. Didn't you actually connect with the Grateful Dead when you met Mickey Hart at the birthday party of a North Indian tabla master, and they hired you to hypnotize Mickey and Billy, the 2 drummers, in order to help them train and play more as like one single organism?
Oh, good heavens, yes. Mickey and Bill, the 2 drummers in the Grateful Dead, were excellent hypnotic subjects, and they wanted me to hypnotize them, and so that they'd be even more in sync than usual. And we did several different types of research. And Mickey, by the way, recorded everything, and it's in his vaults, all of the hypnotic session. For example, I hypnotized them, and I said, now you're going to play as if time has slowed down. And then they played drums with time slowing down. Okay, now you're going to play, time is accelerating. And then they played as if time were accelerating. And sure enough, there were very distinct different styles depending on how they followed the hypnotic suggestion.
Oh, there was one great experiment that Stanley was part of, and me and Billy. And he told Billy that it was time perception. And what he did was, he said, okay, everything that you hear, the track that you hear, he was playing to a track, is going to come real slow to you. And then you'll be able to play in and out of everything. And then he said to me, it's going to come very fast to you, so you'll be able to play around it. And so what we were doing is we were perceiving each other in different ways, whereas I was able to play, it felt like it was coming so fast, so I had to play really slow to be able to fit everything in, and it was the opposite for Bill. And it was an amazing experiment in altered time perception. And I remember that really well. As a matter of fact, I still have the recording. It's called Bill's Box. I just discovered it. And it was that experiment when we were, and Stanley's on the tape giving us these suggestions. And then we went into hypnosis, and we played for, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 minutes. I can't remember. But it was, that was a remarkable day. It taught me about the expansion and contraction of time, and how you perceive time, and how time is totally flexible if you can perceive that flex. And it made the Grateful Dead music into something different, because then we were able to flex and contract at will and not worry about it, and also create a new one, or a new beginning and ending to things, and it wasn't set in stone. So when you start perceiving things in another realm and you become comfortable with it, and you can share that with someone else, then it becomes real. These experiments affected our audience in a tremendous way. It allowed our audience to be able to become deep listeners. And deep listening it's when you hear below the obvious, and you hear inside of things. And that's the spirit voice of everything. And so once they were able to let go of the metric, and that everything had to be perfect and had to be in what you would call in clock time, metric time, in earth time, then you were able to fly. You were able to experience other realms of thought. And that's where all the good stuff is. You know, most of the good stuff you'll find on the periphery of things. That's where the real rich stuff happens. It doesn't usually happen in your normal perception. When you see something, you say, well, that's the way it is. No, you have to look at it or hear at it and have some real ear play or eye play in it, and just focus on it and get in that moment, become part of it, become one with it, and then let go of everything you know, and then go with what is happening in the moment. If you can do that, then there's a chance of great beauty. You know, you can actually create something that's worthwhile creating as opposed to recreating. So that's what it gave the audience. It gave the audience a license to fly, and a license to be able to go to these realms of perception that were not necessarily right in front of you. There was a multi-tiered layers of perception, and that's what this situation is all about. That's what the Grateful Dead music is all about. That's what trance drumming is all about. That's what the psychic experience is all about.
I'm not claiming any incredible results, but the fact that they were adventurous enough to request such a thing, I think attests to their experimental nature and their willingness to try out anything that would help to increase the value and the depth of their art and their collaboration. That's right.
Well, that's certainly very humble of you, Dr. Krippner, but the Grateful Dead definitely did credit you with making them a better band and changing the way that they play and enhancing their synchrony as a collective. And that is a really incredible thing to have in your resume.
It's one of the great compliments of my life. Good grief.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I would also imagine that with your interest in field cognition and parapsychology in general, that being at ground zero to observe the collective mind phenomena that the Grateful Dead was famous for was probably also really interesting for you.
Yes, it was not only on my part, but many people have used the term collective mind, collective consciousness that the Grateful Dead music was able to engender. And I think this is one reason that the Grateful Dead concerts are so well attended. And of course, recently I went to the Grateful Dead concert in the Sphere in Las Vegas. And this is a whole new generation of people for the most part. And they were also reporting similar experiences. Again, consciousness is not a solitary thing. Our own individual mind does not have a wall around it. It's bound to expand into other people's consciousness as well as nature and other living beings as well. Consciousness is a very, very pervasive topic. By consciousness, we're talking about thinking and feeling. That's what consciousness is all about.
Absolutely, Dr. Krippner. Personally, I became aware of the Grateful Dead collective mind phenomena when I realized that the audience very obviously received a specific message from the music despite the fact that it wasn't specifically articulated in the lyrics. Recently, I discovered that mathematical analysis of the Dead's collective improvisations had uncovered golden ratio proportions as well as other organizing principles that are found in natural systems, not only in the parts of the individual instruments, but in their relationships to each other, which is not something that could be achieved through conscious effort. Research at Johns Hopkins and other institutions has determined that brain waves will entrain with golden ratio-based ultrasound oscillations. So taken together, it appears that we may have unveiled the mechanisms that facilitate the collective mind experience that so many deadheads have reported over the decades.
You are very, very well read. Yes, this is cutting edge research. And again, music is very, very primary in the whole field of human evolution. People probably sang before they talk. People use rhythm before they talk. People use drums, rattles, chanting before they talk. So music is very, very primary to the human condition. And as such, of course, it's a part of nature, because in the last analysis, humans are a part of nature. They're not set apart from nature. They're embedded in nature. They're a part of nature, of course.
Speaking of being a part of nature, I've experienced a lot of ESP type phenomena over the years. I've noticed that in every instance where I had these intuitions or non-local information access, downloads, people call them, they're always relevant to what I perceive to be my overall purpose. A few years back, I stumbled across Michael Levin's work on collective goal states, and it hit me that his model was identical to my own framework, but applied to the domain of biology. The idea that ESP is allotted on a sort of need-to-know basis led me to the suspicion that perhaps this is why ESP is so difficult to reproduce in a lab, so to speak. It's not a parlor trick. It's basically a matter of system relevance. Do you have any thoughts on this, Dr. Krippner?
Well, first of all, again, I'm impressed that you're following Michael Levin. I've been aware of his work for years. In fact, I met him several years ago, and we had a wonderful conversation. Now, his work, again, is cutting-edge work, very important work. And I want to make a comment. You don't have to restrict scientific work in a laboratory. There's any number of ways to conduct scientific research outside of a laboratory in natural settings. This has been done for years, and there are journals that specialize in this type of what we call naturalistic qualitative research. And this can be done from a scientific perspective and can yield us very important information, of course. This, in psychological terms, they use the word intention to describe this. If a person intends to do something, this is halfway there to actualizing it. And to go a step further, when we intend to do something consciously, that decision has already been made unconsciously for us. The unconscious knows before the conscious mind what's going to happen. And so this is why it is so important for us to feed positive experiences into our lives, to immerse ourselves in nature, into loving relationships, into wisdom literature, so that when we do make a decision, it's informed by what is already there in our unconscious. I should mention, there's a whole school of thought pioneered by William Tiller, a physicist, and his successors are carrying on the intention experiments, a whole legacy of experiments focusing on intention, and they're carrying on his work and teaching people how to be more intentional. And this, of course, goes into the meditation literature on what's called mindfulness, to become more aware of what you are doing and not just behave like robots, becoming aware and intentional and mindful. All of this is part of the same package, and this helps us to be better human beings. It's so important for people, and I'm talking now about reviewers and listeners, to live their lives in a way that opens themselves up to what's positive in nature. There's so much negativity today in politics and in wars and in environmental disasters. If we wallow in that and let ourselves be immersed in that, our life is not going to be a very happy one. We have to focus on what's happy, joyful, loving, and wise to live a more fulfilling life. Absolutely.
Beautifully stated, Dr. Krippner. That is certainly the message that I hope to impart on this channel, that we need to be more aligned with nature and more aligned with ourselves is certainly my fundamental message. And I just really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to have this conversation with me. You've been a tremendous inspiration, and your work has been incredibly vital to building the foundation that led to the understandings that we have today. So thank you again so much. I'm definitely looking forward to meeting you in person for our next conversation at the Brain and Consciousness Conference in Cuenca, Ecuador in May.
Well, you're very, very welcome. And again, I'm very flattered to hear your comments. But aside from that, I think you're serving a great purpose for your viewers and listeners. And if they keep tuning in on your program, I think they'll be able to learn a great deal and live happier, more joyous, more loving lives. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the kind words, Dr. Krippner.
Okay, you're so welcome. So long.